I'm Sarah Barth, and it is my great privilege to be the Executive Director of Semper Virens Fund. Thank you for joining us in another of our Under the Redwoods webinar series, where we explore the beauty, the history, the science, the art, the magic, the anything you can think of relating to redwood forests. We acknowledge that the redwood forests in the Santa Cruz Mountains, where Semper Virens does its work, is among the ancestral lands for many indigenous peoples who cared for these lands for millennia until they were forcibly removed. And we are grateful to work with some of their descendants today, including the Amamutsin tribal band and the Muwekma Ohlone tribe, to help restore some of their cultural and traditional relationships to these magnificent forests. I also want to thank Scharf Investments, who's been the sponsor of this year's Under the Redwoods webinar series. We really appreciate their support. Many of you have been on these webinars before, but just to remind you, you can post questions in the chat or in the Q&A, and we'll try to get to as many of them as we can, either during the webinar or sometimes we follow up the webinar with emails. The event will be recorded and posted on our YouTube channel. And I'm especially excited to note that for the first time ever, we are offering live closed captioning of this webinar in an ongoing effort to try to be more inclusive and welcoming. We are trying to make this webinar series more accessible to a broader audience. So click the closed captioning icon at the bottom of your screen, and that will help you access that if that's of interest to you. So just quick update from Semper Virens before we get into the meat of the matter with our guest. We've had a tough winter in this region and in this landscape. I'm sure our guests will speak about that. But spring is now here and may already be moving on to summer. Our natural resources manager, Beatrix Jimenez Helsley, has been chronicling that spring, and in particular the super bloom that has been happening. It's gotten a lot of coverage. Beatrix spent time with reporters from the Washington Post and the San Francisco Chronicle, among others. And I think you can probably see links to those stories. Yep, it looks like they're in our chat. I'm sure they're on our website as well. They did a great job profiling the extraordinary wildflowers that we have in this region and that we are seeing in particular this year following the rains. And that follows on some unusual blooms that we've been seeing since the fire of 2020. The CZU wildfire. We've seen some extraordinary wildflowers following that as well. So it's been pretty magical, and I encourage you to learn more about it. Later this week, we will be sharing more information and stories about the super bloom that's happening on our own San Vicente Redwoods property. So stay tuned. The other big news that's also been in the news from Semper Virens is that we recently completed several small land acquisitions. These are small but mighty in terms of conservation because of their location adjacent to an area right next to Big Basin State Park called Saddle Mountain. And I'm sure we'll talk a bit about it today with Chris, but those properties are important because they will play an essential role in providing visitor services, visitor experiences, recreational opportunities, and also helping to get some of the most important infrastructure of the park out of the old growth groves where it previously was and into other less ecologically important areas. So that's been a big body of work, and I'm sure we'll talk more about that as well and how it is part of the larger approach that Semper Virens has been playing at Big Basin since that park was created over 100 years ago. And that is just ever adding to and working to enhance those forests. So in that context, I'm so pleased to welcome this month's guest to our Under the Redwoods webinar. We have with us California State Parks Superintendent for the Santa Cruz District of State Parks, Chris Spoher. Chris, please join us. And before I let him have the floor, I will just say that we are incredibly privileged and fortunate to have Chris in this role. He has huge amount of responsibility. I'll ask him to start by maybe giving the audience a little bit of a thumbnail sketch of all the lands and resources he's responsible for managing. But what I am grateful for is that he is a strategic, and creative and innovative thinker. And he's phenomenally successful in navigating partnerships with a wide variety of stakeholders, including Semper Virens Fund, for the benefit of the natural resources and the people in this region. So we are super fortunate to have Chris as our partner. Okay, with that, Chris, maybe can I ask you to start with just, as I said, a thumbnail sketch of the resources that are under your purview, and then maybe tell us a little bit about what's been happening the last couple of years in this region and how climate change has really had a dramatic impact in this part of the state park system, maybe more so than any other region in the state. So let me give you the floor.
Well, great. I appreciate that. Thank you, Sarah. And you know, a lot of the success that we have here is due to the strong partnerships that we have. Semper Virens being one of our foundational partners and standing side by side with us through a lot of these difficult times this winter. But yeah, I have a great job. I get to work in the most beautiful place in the world, the Central California area of state parks. And our district, which is the Santa Cruz district, spans all of the state parks and beaches in Santa Cruz and San Mateo counties. So there are 30 distinct parks and beaches there. Some of them have subunits, so it seems like there's maybe more than that, but it's really 30 units covering the two counties at 65,000 acres. You know, we're still hopeful we can add to that acreage strategically, but it's highly diverse in that we have you know, a lot of beaches that people are familiar with. We have some out of the way places that are lesser known, lots of pocket beaches in San Mateo. We have redwood forests. We have lots of coastal grasslands. So it is a very diverse area as far as ecologically speaking. And then we have this overlap between the southern region of the state and the northern region of the state, both of which have, you know, sensitive species. A lot of times those species ranges overlap here. And so we have an extraordinarily high diversity of our biological diversity here. So that is a special charge that we have, you know, in protecting the ecology here, and then also providing for high quality recreation. So we get a large amount of visitation. We have people coming from not only these counties, but from across the state, from across this country, and we have a lot of international visitors, multi-generational people that have been coming here for a long time. And one of the things that we really try to provide is these experiences where people can be immersed in these diverse landscapes, from hiking to biking, and with a lot of camping. And unfortunately, because of recent events, starting with the CZU fire in 2020, we did lose a lot of those amenities. We lost a lot of camping opportunities, and that's difficult. And then I'll talk a little bit about this winter, where we actually lost even more opportunities for camping, sadly. But you know, this winter, I think if it had come immediately after the CZU fire, I think we would have seen much more extensive debris flows and the kind of damage we were worrying about immediately after the fire with the large rains. But because it was you know, a couple of years after that, the mountain parks, they had a fair bit of damage, but it wasn't the kind of catastrophic losses that we were worrying about, losing whole roads, you know, or massive landslides. It did not happen in the parks. Where we did have really significant damage was on our coastal parks, specifically at Seacliff State Beach. It was that combination of that super high tide and very large swell, January 5th, that created, probably exacerbated, you know, by sea level rise and what we know is a changing climate. We had, in the span of about an hour, catastrophic losses along the beach there. So half of the Seacliff Pier was lost. The entirety of a 63 site campground right on the beach completely wiped out. We lost more than 50% of the seawall protecting both the day use and that camping area. You know, and we suffered a lot of losses at New Brighton and other adjacent beaches. We lost a lot of our beach access. The public will remember, you know, how different the beach looked there. I can remember going down there and seeing like a 15-foot elevation difference from where we had sand prior to that event. So that took our attention for sure. And so I sort of pivoted from, 2 years of solid fire recovery work to really thinking about coastal erosion. And it put a really fine point on this idea that the changing climate is going to impact all of our public open space, our conservation areas, places the public is used to visiting and cherishing. We really have to think about not just, wildfire, we have to think about our positioning for resilience on the coast and how we can build these places and maintain them and steward them so that they're available into the future and they're going to be more resilient than they currently are, given that the climate is changing. Similarly, when we're looking at our forests, we're looking at managing them into the future, Big Basin being a perfect example, standing back and just sort of watching them and letting them be and being satisfied that they're protected as parks and we have camping there, and that's not going to be enough. We are going to have to take a much more active role, a proactive role with our partners and our adjoining land management, agencies and partners in the region to steward the forests. And that means the public is going to see things like more prescribed fire, more active management, and we can talk more about it when it comes to large tree restoration, things like that. But this winter really, being so close to what we saw in the season of fire, it was for me, it was really, we have to look at the totality of the landscapes we're working in, the ocean, the beach, the environment, our grasslands, our forests, and just remember that climate change is here and it is affecting us already. So every time we make a management decision, we really need to be thinking about that with the public, about what that means, how we can do it, and be more sustainable and resilient in the future.
I think that my sense is that this district has been hit harder. Many parts of the state have been hit by these kinds of climate impacts, but the sort of sequence of events in this region and this district has been particularly acute. And it's a region where it has already been known for innovation, for strong local partners, for a variety of reasons. It has often been at the forefront of trying new things. And certainly we're going to talk, I'm sure, a lot about reimagining Big Basin, but I have seen this district be very open-minded and innovative in its response to the catastrophic wildfire. Do you imagine, two questions, do you imagine you will bring that same level of innovation and open-mindedness to the way you respond to our ocean parks? And do you think that that's going to provide leadership statewide to the state park agency around how to think differently about climate? Or do you see this as just a little microcosm that, is unique?
Well, I think, for whatever reason, the district here has sustained a lot of impact recently.
Yeah.
And like we just said, it seems to exemplify what we're all facing. I don't know why it all happened so quickly here, but it did. I appreciate what you said there, about being innovative, and part of it is we have to be, and part of it is it's the right thing to do. Part of it is that we have partners and we have a supportive public here, very supportive. And so what I've found is there's a willingness to accept that, the change is here, and we need to respond appropriately. We need to be responsible about it. We really need to think about it. If that can serve to help model for other areas, I think that's excellent. But I've also seen, especially with regards to the way we're looking statewide at our, the lands that we manage on the beach. Our Sacramento headquarters area, their support staff is really, I think, leading the charge there, but will support us greatly here. And I think while it is a loss at Seacliff, it's also, we have to look at it as an opportunity. This is that opportunity to step in and say, okay, now that we have seen this kind of damage, we can see what happened. We expect to see more of it. Let's really put the philosophy that we've been talking about into practice here. Let's really do that vulnerability assessment for sea level rise. Let's really use that information to project what is going to be feasible. What are the right steps to do at Seacliff to build back in an innovative way that makes sense? So I do think it's going to serve as that example, but it's definitely in concert with what our department is looking at statewide for, you know, what we're facing. Ideally, we would get ahead of this curve. Ideally, we would not have to wait as a rebuild. You know, we'll start taking those steps. We are taking some, but you know, this is a vast landscape. We manage, I think it's like more than a third of the California coastline.
Yeah.
And so it is a Herculean task to do this. And in the coastal zone, there are other layers of complexity there, you know, and so looking for options for how you can position infrastructure so it's going to be more resilient, it's definitely going to be a challenge. But I think what I'm seeing here locally with our support of the public is, yes, there's a loss, there's sadness there. And yes, it's time to think about how we can do this so it will be there for the next 7 generations, you know?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and I think I have always liked that Semper Virens works very locally, but often tries to think about models beyond. And we thought about it that way when Big Basin burned, and we engaged with you all about what comes next.
Yeah.
As I think did you. And my hope is that that kind of approach, which has been really inclusive, pretty open-minded, willing to be very different than the past. I'm hoping that that not only creates a model for forest parks elsewhere, but can help you as you deal with the coastal parks in your own district. So anyway, well, let's talk about forest management, because that's something that's of great interest to this audience. Maybe start with just an outline of what people might see or feel if they were in Big Basin or anywhere in that Redwood belt post-fire now, because it's been a couple of years and not everybody has been back onto the landscape. And what do you think is going to be different about the management of those forests going forward? You've already alluded a bit to it, but let's delve into that a bit.
Good. Well, I talked about this in the past, you know, immediately following the fire, probably that first year, going back into the fire zone, you know, not only are we experiencing the loss of the structures and so that emotional loss, and I know our neighbors there, many people lost so much, it's really heartbreaking. And then just to see the forest in such a different light. I mean, there was very little color there. The canopy was missing for huge areas.
Yeah.
It's disorienting. It's, you know, it just feels like things have changed for good, like they're not going to come back. I'm very glad to say that, you know, coming up on 3 years post-fire, it looks very different in there now. So, you know, there is the loss of a lot of the Douglas fir trees, which did provide a portion of the canopy there. Those trees are not resilient to fire the way redwoods are. The redwoods, though, being highly resistant, are almost universally coming back. And so we're seeing incredible resprouting, not just from the base, but, you know, the entire chunks of the trees. Some trees with slightly less severe burning of the canopy, their branches are all resprouting. And so, you know, you might give it a second look, you might think, oh, that tree didn't burn. I mean, oh, it did burn, but it's really coming back. So that's remarkable to see that. And then the understory, it varies from area to area, but I mean, it is lush green. This winter really kicked that into high gear. You know, it was starting, but so fire followers like ceanothus, which has that, you know, a lot of cases that fragrant blue flower. It's probably waist to chest high now in a lot of areas. And I'm going to say by the end of this summer, it's probably going to be 15 feet tall. So this is that understory that comes in after fire, fixes nitrogen from the air and starts really preparing the understory for that next succession of species that's going to come in. But it's verdant in there. And then lots of grasses, lots and lots of huckleberry resprouting. So it burned and it killed the top portion of that, but now it's all mead at waist high growing back from the stumps. The same thing with a lot of our hardwoods. So we have oaks, we have can oaks, we have madrone. These are trees that would have been 20, 30, 40, 50 feet tall, the tops of which were killed and looked like a dead forest right after the fire. They are resprouting significantly from the base. So we're starting to see that understory build back. And then in a lot of the zones, you know, where you're just kind of on the edge of redwoods or you're getting into that south basin where we had chaparral. Chaparral is sprouting back looks really, really good. You know, it's coming back to just the way you want it to, filling in. And then the understory in between those transition zones, lots of flower. I was just up on North Escape Road, and the iris vernaldi, which is that sort of apricot-y, yellowy iris, is just blooming everywhere. It's absolutely beautiful. Lots of things like soap lilies. I even saw some Fremont rhododendron in there. But I was struck by just how diverse that is. Number one, things you would have noticed in the past, but you wouldn't have really been awestruck by. It's like I was awestruck by that. So that looks amazing. You know, you can still sense that the canopy is partial, right? So we're getting a lot more sunlight in there, but that's providing opportunities for different wildflowers, a lot more grasses. The meadows where they were little pockets have expanded, and they are looking very good. So the experience now is one of sort of wonder at how much has come back, that you can really feel the recovery of the forest. And you get a sense, because when you're in there, you know, around the higher use areas, we had to cut out all the standing dead dug first and the standing dead hardwood just to make it safe to go in there. So you get, when you're in that area, it's a lot more open, and you get a sense of what the forest might look like. Certainly the ancient forest, you know, with fire running through it. It's that open sense. You can kind of see a longer distance. You can see past that, though, where the standing dead is still there, and you can kind of get a sense for the kind of work that's ahead of us. So the park is over 18,000 acres. We've really worked on very small little pockets here and there. The bigger challenge is going forward. It's thinking about the next 100 years. It's thinking about how can we manage more actively across that landscape scale, do it strategically, and do it in a way that sets us up so that the forest is going to be healthier, it's going to be more resilient to wildfire in the future. And it's also going to start expanding those old growth characteristics, you know, into areas that fire, you know, weren't showing those. So that's going to be like our second growth redwood forest. Those pieces of the park that have been added after they had been harvested one time. So there, you know, we're thinking about things like what you guys did at Semper Virens at your 236 property, where really kind of pioneering that, along with, say, the Redwoods League and their Redwoods Rising project up north, where you're thinking about large tree restoration, and you're thinking about actively manage second growth so that you can change that trajectory to the forest is going to become, it's going to have those characteristics of old growth. It's going to be more resilient to wildfire. And what that means is you're going to have probably fewer trees per acre, but you're going to have a robust understory. It's going to mean that for us, we're starting to plan things like larger scale prescribed fire. So whereas over the last 3 decades, we've been burning 200 to 300 acres, which is pretty good. I mean, you know, we've all felt good about what we've been able to accomplish. It's not going to meet the goals of a forest management strategy over an entire 18,000 acre park. So we're looking at 1,000 acre plots now. So, you know, part of what our visitors are going to see when they're coming into Big Basin specifically is that we're starting to use existing roads and sometimes trails where we're going to be taking out a lot of standing dead trees so that we can use those existing access points as control lines for much larger prescribed fire. So we're hoping this fall we can burn about 1,000 acres with CAL FIRE. That would be significant, but that's our rotation. We'll restore the fire regime in there to something that could reduce fuels and set us up so that any fire that's going to go through there is going to be lower intensity. That's what we're going to try to avoid, is another high intensity fire like we saw with CVU.
Yeah, fire expert Scott Stevens was on one of our webinars in the last couple of years, and he basically said, following that fire, the CZU fire, that if he had his brothers, Big Basin would be burned every year or two. Big chunks of it would be burned. So if you're doing 1,000 acres treatment at a time for a 16 or 17,000 acre park, where we may, even with that scale, we may be behind a bit in the amount of fuel reduction that needs to be done. How are you all thinking about getting to that scale, given how hard it is to do prescribed burns?
Yeah, I mean, it's never easy, right? I've really noticed, you know, probably in the last 5 years, how much more we're talking about it. Not just
Yeah.
in webinars like this, where we're really, we're focused on it as land managers, but I'm just hearing it like on the radio. I'm seeing
Yeah.
talk about it more. I
Yeah.
think your average member of the public is probably starting to hear about it and think about it a lot more than they used to. And the reason is it's one of the only answers that we have
Yeah.
to address what we're seeing on the landscape, right? So that's where we're going to go. And of course, it is an inherently dangerous thing to do. And so we have to really think about all the planning, be strategic, put in those shaded fuel breaks, do the fuel reductions, do the things we need to do to prep for it. We need to be thoughtful about the placement of infrastructure. That's a big deal. So as we think about reimagining Big Basin, where we put infrastructure will dictate how easy or difficult we make it, to use fire as a tool and to use it for stewardship. And so that's a big part of it. And then I think, one of the things I'm really keyed in on at all of our Redwood parks is to show active management all the time. So when you come into Henry Cowell now, or you go up to Fall Creek, or you go into Portola, you're going to start to see burn pile. You're going to start to see active management in places that you never saw it before. We're going to be doing that, with volunteers, with our own team, with partners, so that really everybody can see that this is part of parks. This is part of being part of the park community. You're going to want to know about this. Maybe you're going to want to participate, but you're certainly going to see it. We just burned a bunch of piles at Henry Cowell, and it was one of the most amazing things to walk through that day use area, through the Redwood Loop, with our docents, and the public they just couldn't believe they were seeing active fire right in the place that they've been there. They'd never seen that before, and they were allowed to see it in a safe way and then learn about why we're doing it. It was great. So we're doing the same thing at Big Basin. And then I just want to mention that we're getting ready to think about a demonstration plot at Big Basin, where we're probably going to be doing some removal of smaller redwoods and smaller trees, so that we can start approaching a landscape there in certain second growth that will start looking like it's going to end up becoming more old growth, right? And that's going to allow us to demonstrate how we do it. It's going to make sure the public is really well informed about the science behind it. We'll probably be able to burn in there and show more of that. But I'm really pleased with the way the media seems to really be focusing on using fire as a tool, as a really important and necessary step. And I sense that that is going to make it easier for us to burn. Because what comes with that is an understanding of the liability, an understanding that smoke is part of what we're going to just have to deal with. We'll do our best to mitigate it, but those are the sorts of hurdles that the public can really help us with.
Yeah, and I feel like part of our job at Semper Virens, well, twofold. One is to make sure Redwood lovers and people who love these parks understand why this is important and beneficial to the long-term health of this landscape, rather than having people be concerned that somehow state parks is mismanaging these properties. I think that's something, that's a role that we can play that I hope will be constructive, and things like this webinar are part of that. And the other is I see us being part of the effort to expand the parks in strategic ways, so that facilities can be located in places that are safer for the public and safer for the old growth. And secondly, so that you have more leeway and more buffer around the areas that you need to burn, because understandably neighbors are going to be nervous about that. So I think the more we can expand these parks in ways that allow for the kind of forest management you're talking about, the better it will be. And that's where I see us playing a role in partnership with you all in supporting what you're trying to do.
Absolutely. And I want to make this other point. Prescribed fire is difficult to plan and navigate. It's difficult to execute. One of the things that makes it easier is where the boundaries are, right? So we have built parks with the help of partners like Semper Virens over many, many years. And there are gaps in that ownership. There are pieces. These are geopolitical property line issues. When you're dealing with fire, that can be really difficult to navigate. And so as you can think strategically about, if we're going to manage this larger area and we're going to then be able to conserve a piece that wasn't in park ownership before, we can use a treatment like prescribed fire across the landscape. And we can set ourselves up for success that way versus challenging, if we have sort of those boundaries that make it difficult for us to really execute some of this stuff. So I think that's something that's an important part of long-term park planning that partners can really help with.
Yeah, well, and what we've seen is that, Semper Virens only buys from willing sellers. I haven't seen you all engage in eminent domain in our region I don't even know when. But I am seeing a lot of people in the region who are tired of the fires, the flooding, and who have decided it's time to leave. And I think that has presented us with some extraordinary opportunities to help purchase those properties that are really strategic for you all. So with that being said, maybe it's a good segue into what is coming up with regard to the public planning process and next phases with Big Basin. And I do want to say for our audience, this is just a sort of preliminary conversation that we're having between a partner organization and state parks. But of course, what you're describing or what you're going to explain to us is something that will be a very formal public process that allows for anybody to weigh in and share their perspectives with you.
Yeah, right. So we went through this reimagining, and that was about a year process, engaging the public, giving the future vision for Big Basin. That is going to guide everything that comes after that, right? So we started with that general plan, which is a public planning document. We went through the planning process that was certified in 2013. With the change to the landscape, the loss of the infrastructure, the loss of historic buildings with the CZU fire, we really needed to re-engage with the public, as soon after that fire as we could, to make sure that we have a shared vision going forward. And that vision is a general vision, but it's got some really strong guidance in there. And so what the public is supporting going forward, it really looks like focusing in on the ancient forest, the long-term health of it in the face of climate change. And what that means is we're going to need to find places to relocate infrastructure, to rebuild outside of the ancient forest, but really making sure we have access there. That's a huge another, tenet of the guidance in that reimagining, is to make sure we're providing equal access, we're providing more access, in fact, we're being inclusive. But the infrastructure itself has to be really thoughtful, has to be, in areas that are not going to impede our ability to manage the park. So this next stage, and we will be announcing it this summer, sort of like the dates when we're going to be able to launch it and where we're going to have engagement opportunities for the public, of which there will be many. We're calling that a facility management plan. And it's going to be that more high resolution plan where we take the guidance that's in the reimagining and we're actually looking at where does the campground go, how many parking spots are we going to have, where are the main access points, where is the welcome center going to be, where are we going to have the trailheads if they're going to change. It also looks at the real heart of making sure we have the ability to operate 24/7 365 type of park, which means electrical. Right. So where are we gonna have our electrical hookup? Where it's going to come from? We're going to be looking at our wastewater, water system, distribution. All of that was highly damaged in the fire. So we are going to be looking at all aspects of the park from a facility standpoint. And we'll be working with a consultant team, but there will be engagements for the public. We'll have opportunities for public meetings, or with information being put out, with soliciting information. And that will all go into probably a 2-year planning process, because this is a big park and we have a lot of infrastructure we need to plan, and it's relatively complicated. But on the end of that, we will have a plan where we can start going into project construction plans, and we will start phasing in that sort of construction and rebuilding. Now, we're not going to wait until the very end of that to do anything. We're starting now. We've been opening trails and roads for the public. Last summer, we were able to open up the park by reservation, and since that time, we had a minor setback slightly major setback this winter where we had to close a lot of the trails that we had previously opened. But I'm glad to say that all of that now is reopened. And so we have a fair bit of route trails and roads that are now open to the public. And we expect to keep expanding that throughout the planning period. So we'll be expanding that. The other thing I think is exciting to think about this summer is we're very hopeful to have some limited camping available at Rancho del Oso. So there's an existing campground there that we're going to be opening up by reservation. And so we'll be announcing that as well. But I also wanted to talk a little bit about what we've been doing before this facility management plan formally gets announced and we start speaking with the public about it that way. We have done a fair bit of planning, or actually sort of feasibility work. If you can imagine, after a fire like this with infrastructure that's been damaged, even if you have the good idea to move things around, it's not super straightforward. And so we're really looking at, where can we do that? What are those opportunities? And then focusing in on kind of needed information that will inform this next facility management plan. A big one is working with PG&E. So I'm glad to say that the design for electrical infrastructure is complete and PG&E has committed to putting everything underground. It's huge.
Well, that's great. That'll reduce fire risk considerably. I would
Totally.
imagine.
So that's gonna go through a permitting period, but that's gonna, I'd say in the next 2 years, that's gonna go into the ground. We're doing a hydrology study. So focusing in a lot of cases, it's on like the Redwood Loop area, former campground areas. This will inform any restoration actions that we may take to enhance water availability to Redwoods. We know that's going to be a challenge with a changing climate. So that's a big deal. It'll also inform sort of how we can place infrastructure. A shuttle feasibility study. So one of the things that we're thinking about is alternative modes of transportation into the park and having less congestion. So that will inform sort of the flow of traffic and what we may be able to do with shuttles in the coming plan. But it's very likely that we're going to have a pilot project from Saddle Mountain down into the former headquarters area. And then we're looking at another option from Scotts Valley. So we'll see if that's going to work out. And then a visitor use management study. That's starting this summer. We're going to be monitoring visitor use. We're going to be surveying people, but this is really going to help inform the kind of conditions that people would like to see and those ways the indicators that we'll use to monitor those. So that's sort of gathering that type of information that you really want to create the visitor experience that the public wants. And then last, the road feasibility study. That's going to be the biggest challenge, unfortunately. So, it's already difficult to get to Big Basin and certainly different parts of it, making sure that we have safe access that's maintainable for the public to get in and out of new use areas. So we're looking at existing road infrastructure, where we can use that, where we're going to have to upgrade it. But, if you remember from the reimagining, the lower Sky Meadow area has been identified as that overnight accommodation area. So that's where camping is going to be, potentially cabins, making sure we can get the public in there, service the campground, and make sure there's adequate access out of there in multiple ways. I think that's going to be a big deal. But all that stuff it's speaking to what's going to inform this facility management plan. And we're excited to get going on that.
We're excited to have you get going on it. And I think what you've just been describing for some of our listeners may be eye-opening in terms of the amount of infrastructure that you're having to contend with. And when people are frustrated that the park isn't open or more of it's not accessible, I know we've been trying to remind people that it's basically like rebuilding a rural city or a city level infrastructure to accommodate thousands of people in a really rural and rugged setting. So there's a lot to contend with. What do you think is a realistic time frame, roughly, for when visitor services may be more back to what they were? Not that they're going to be recreated, but I mean, where the level of accessibility, where a visitor center, are we talking about a decade? Are we talking about 4 years, 20 years? What's the time horizon you and your team are thinking in around this?
So I'm willing to say 2 years for this more high definition planning for the facility. During that time, we'll be adding certain improvements. So like right now, we're in a phase 2 interim development at Saddle Mountain, where we're going to be adding some facilities there that's going to help manage the park. But I would say probably within 5 years, we're going to start to see a fair bit more infrastructure being a little bit better. I think that we will still be at it 10 years from now, you know?
Yeah.
But I'd like to say within 5 years, I think we will be pushing and we'll be seeing some more significant infrastructure rebuild.
And one of the legacy projects of Semper Virens was the creation of the Skyline to the Sea Trail, which was closed as a result of the fire. And for those who aren't familiar with it, it's a long, multi-day hiking trail that goes from the crest of the Santa Cruz Mountains down to the ocean, and it passes by Big Basin and Castle Rock and a bunch of other important places. Anyway, I'm curious what news you have, if any, around the reopening of that. And of course, I will mention to people that we are, Semper Virens is in the process of trying to buy some additional properties to add to Castle Rock State Park to support that trail on the assumption that it will eventually reopen. But any news with regard to Skyline to the Sea Trail that you can share?
Yeah, a little update here. We did just recently open a small segment of it right in the heart of Big Basin. So the segment that goes between the Gaza Street, where the bridge crosses there, and it parallels the creek up to North Escape. So we just opened that, and we're trying to focus on sort of loop trails from the parking area that the public can use. That segment had relatively few amenities on it, like trail bridges and staircases and things. The backcountry, and so basically the piece downstream from our day use parking area towards Rancho Del Oso, that's the significant part of why we haven't opened it yet. It has a lot of infrastructure on it, and it's very difficult to get to. And so that will take longer. It's probably on the order of still a couple of years out to get that fully done. But we are building capacity with trail recovery. So, you know, we have the Triple Cs now living in the park sort of year round. And so that's adding to our own staff's ability to work on these trails. We're also looking to work with our partners, the Santa Cruz Trail Stewards, to add some capacity that way. So the timeline could change, and I know it's frustrating to not have access to that trail. But the truth is, we haven't even seen that since the storm. So when I talk about trees coming down in the park, I mean, we were able to clear the immediate use area and get the 8 or 9 miles open closest in that we've had open, but those more distant areas out in the wilderness, certainly out at that distance, there's going to be a lot more trees down close this storm season than there was after the fire. So we're going to have setbacks that way too. But regardless, you know, it's a goal we hear about all the time. It's certainly something to think about. It's just a matter of the logistics to get out there. And to us, you know, it really made more sense to focus in early on accessible loop trails from the access point, and then work our way outwards, you know, to get to those more distant trails that are in the backcountry.
Yeah. So I'm going to ask one last question, and then we'll take my colleague will share with us some of the questions from the audience. I talked about how open-minded I think you and your colleagues in this district have been in response to the fire. And one of the things I've been really pleased and impressed with is that as the discussions around reimagining Big Basin have moved forward, you have invited to the table a lot of stakeholders who have not been part of the discussion in the past. Semper Virens has been your partner since the park was created, as have some of the other organizations that have been in dialogue with you ever since the fire and from long before. But I've seen you really open up and bring in additional voices. I'm thinking in particular of dialogue you've been in with some of the tribal partners in this region and a variety of other stakeholders who just haven't always historically been at the table. And I'm curious if you can tell us a little bit about what that's like and what, if anything, you've learned from those efforts. You know, has your mind been opened? Have you started to see things differently as a result of those new conversations and new voices participating?
Yeah. Well, I appreciate the question, because we have been and continue to make quite an effort to be more inclusive in the plan. And, we all know that the park has developed over 100 years,
Yeah,
but we never sat down all at once and thought about the whole thing together, right? But that's this opportunity. And so
yes,
it's to us, like,
extraordinary.
yeah,
Awful that it had to happen this way, but
right.
pretty extraordinary opportunity.
Yeah, and so given that and trying to look at it in a positive light as far as an opportunity, then let's try to be more inclusive about who's at the table, the ideas that come forward, because the goal is to make the park more accessible, right? More inclusive. And so listening to different perspectives and putting an extra effort to make sure that we're hearing those voices that sometimes aren't heard or traditionally haven't been heard. That was a big deal to us. We really wanted to do that. And so I was really, I was impressed with people's willingness to participate, because it takes a lot of work. And so tribal partners, the Amamutsan tribal band, the Mweth Maloney, have dug in and really, participated and not really held back. They let us know what they felt like, and that they had been excluded in the past, and that's fair. That's hopefully not going forward what's going to be the case. But things that have come out of it, are making sure that we're really thinking about traditional indigenous ecological knowledge. And it's not like, let's look backwards and just, think about how things have been done from time immemorial. It's like, there is space at the table to participate from now on. Like,
Yeah.
So our tribal partners seem very intent on active stewardship going forward, and that's what we're trying to encourage. And that doesn't just happen. You have to think about places to make that happen. And so, I think thinking about ceremonial space, thinking about incorporating ceremony of prayer in the type of work that goes on, making sure that there's sort of a workforce pipeline where we can have youth from the tribe participate, teach others, and have that become a part of the current culture. That's all. We heard all that. That's a big deal. And I think our partners heard that we want to do that, and it will take everybody to help make that happen. And then another thing, we're partnering with Parks California, and they have helped us with a community-based grant program, and that has allowed us to sort of help fund participation from additional groups. So Latino Outdoors, the group from Community Bridges, Saved by Nature, and we're hoping that the disabled hikers are all now looking to participate in ongoing in our planning effort. And it will make a difference to the final plan, those voices, and that's really important. But we really heard that inclusiveness, accessibility, all these things are fundamental to what people want to see in the upcoming plan.
Yeah, and we're grateful that you're doing it. For sure. All right, well, I could ask you lots more questions, but then our audience will be frustrated. So I'm going to open the floor to my colleague who's been monitoring the Q&A and the chat, and ask him to share with you what questions the audience has raised.
This has been great to get these updates and to hear more about what's happened and what's to come. There was a question about working to protect and improve biodiversity, kind of a broad scale question. And I was wondering if you could start maybe or talk a little bit about how your team is thinking about biodiversity at scale in your active management plans, not only at Big Basin and its recovery, but throughout the district.
Yeah, great. That's a great question. Because one of the things that's sort of a concept that's hard to translate out is that the reason that we have such a diverse biological diversity there is the historic diversity of the landscape. And that diversity is maintained through sort of dynamic events, right? And so we can look and we can call a fire a disaster, and we can call a flood a disaster. And in a lot of cases, they are disastrous depending on what has been lost, to you personally or your access. On the other hand, a lot of flooding and a lot of fire is part of natural process. And so our job across the district in those areas that we manage and steward is to try and make sure that we're not impeding natural processes that are part of maintaining a landscape in a diversity of habitat. And so that is sort of the lens we look at, right? And so while we don't want to have a catastrophic wildfire, we want to make sure that fire is part of the ongoing stewardship across many different types of ecosystems because it's necessary, it's critical. And through that fire, you get this mosaic of habitats, which provides the ability for a diversity of species to thrive. And when you lose that, when you stop those processes, when you suppress fire or you channelize creeks and you prevent flooding, over time, you minimize that disturbance regime, you minimize the diversity of landscapes, you have less habitat available for those diversity of species. So that's kind of the philosophy of how state park looks at management. We're trying to ensure that natural processes can continue, keeping a diverse matrix of habitats healthy. So prescribed fire is one of the ways that we do that. So when I talked about expanding our prescribed fire program, it's a recognition that fire is an important and necessary part of the landscape. We just need to do it larger and more regularly, treat more acres of it. And when we think about the way we're going to put parks back together after kind of like a reimagined park, if a creek needs to flood every 50 years or every 40 years in order to move sediment and seeds around and scour the banks, you want to make sure that your infrastructure isn't going to impede that, because that's going to prevent us from allowing that to happen. So that sort of thoughtful placement of infrastructure is a part of it. Hopefully that answers it.
That's great, Chris. Yes, thank you. And you moved into talking about fire as a tool. There were a couple questions about the process, and I'll hone in on one thing. When you're setting up a prescribed burn, what goes into that work before the prescribed burn happens, particularly with communications to the public?
Yeah, good. I'm going to just start with, we can always do better with communications outwardly about things. So we're constantly looking to do better. But I'll start with it's a in-depth planning process, and we typically do that with partners, either adjacent larger landowner or more typically with CAL FIRE. And so there is a plan written for an entire state park unit. And then within that unit, we'll break it down into projects. So we'll do a specific plan for whatever it is, 200 acres or 1,000 acres within the unit. And into that plan goes a very thoughtful prescription, and that's the climate or the weather conditions under which we can burn safely. And so we dial that into the fire effects that we want to have. And so there's a lot of fire knowledge, fire effects, fire ecology that goes into thinking about that. And then there's the safety aspect, making sure that whatever we do, we can keep within the containment lines, the holding lines that we set up. And then we design all that. We have to implement that. We also have to get permits through our air quality district. And part of doing that is informing them how we're going to do our outreach to the public. And the outreach is typically with press release. It's typically getting out to radio stations. We have a social media platform with multiple platforms that we use to put information out. We try to incorporate information into our interpretive elements of programming. And on the very lowest level, in certain cases where we can't get any other way, we make personal phone calls and we call people. But we typically hit 3 or 4 different media outlets to try our media modes of communication to try and broadcast the information out. Again, we're always looking for better and more ways to get that information out.
That's really helpful. I'm sure folks appreciate that. I wanted to get back to biodiversity. We love marbled merlets. I know you do too. Can you tell us what you know about how marbled murrelets are faring? And there was a question about whether we know if the loss of canopy cover is making it a little easier for corvids to find murrelets.
Yeah, good questions. I'm not sure it has absolute answers on this. I can let everybody know the general thought of our experts here following the fire was that the primary habitat for murrelet nesting was not going to be useful after the fire. That turned out not to be true. We were very happy to see murrelets using and successfully fledging right in the heart of Big Basin. So that was super optimistic. I know that there's been a lot of survey work done in the last couple of years. I don't, other than to say that murrelets are certainly using these forests post-fire. I don't have numbers that I can share, but maybe I can follow up with that if we can get them. And as far as corvids, they're opportunistic. They're going to use anything they can to survive. We are seeing corvids in the burned areas, but we also probably have a lot less anthropomorphic food substances available for them because we haven't been able to open camping and we have limited public access at Basin right now. It's certainly something we're thinking about in the reimagined park. That's going to be a big theme about keeping our crumb clean campaign going and making sure that we have secure areas for food and not make them unavailable for corvids.
Chris, is it accurate that other than the Doug fir, you're not seeing major impacts on other species, plants or otherwise, in terms of the fire? Meaning, it's not like this has been this major extinction crisis within the park after the fire. That's my understanding, that other than the Doug fir, a lot of the species are doing well, and in fact, the absence of visitors has probably been a good thing for them.
Yeah, I would say that we're probably seeing a higher diversity of species, just because you have fire followers, you have these, the environment has changed, right? And so
you have all that disturbance that happened.
So that's happening. I mean, we are keeping our eye on for invasive exotics. We do have staff that's a primary focus to find them early on and treat them early on before we think their infestation takes off. But sadly, the reason a lot of those species are invasive is because they have this extraordinary ability to exploit opportunity. So things like French broom are booming, and we're just having to stay on top of it. Other things like thistles, those are usually ephemeral, short-term, sort of invasive plants that will not survive once the canopy regenerates. There's a lot of studies going on in the park. We have partnered with a lot of different academic nonprofit partners that are doing ongoing research about moss, lichen, microbes, bird, mammals, all that stuff is going on. That will also help inform us going forward. But no, we're not seeing like this was a wipeout event for certain species, not really, no.
Yeah. All right, well, we are unfortunately out of time, but I do want to thank you both for your leadership in the region and partnership to Semper Virens, and for speaking with us today, given everything else that you've got to do. So I really appreciate it. And I will certainly, for this audience, Semper Virens will be a resource for keeping people up to date on what the public planning process is. I know parks will reach out to people. Are you still using the Reimagining website, Chris? Do you want to share that with people as a place for them to go if they want to participate in this ongoing public planning that's going to happen?
Yes, perfect. Yeah, if we could get that link up at some point to your viewers, that would be great. But that's going to be still a central hub. We're going to be updating it. There will be links to other resources as we get into this facility management planning process. And I had it was great talking with you. I'm glad to share these things, and thank you all for the support for Semper Virens, because we could be lonely out there without partners like Semper Virens. We really appreciate the support. And then just the focus on those critical needs. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. And to our audience, thanks for joining us. Please join us next month when we'll have Siren Nagakiri, actually from Disabled Hikers, which Chris mentioned is one of the stakeholder organizations that is participating increasingly in Big Basin discussions. And Siren will be there next month on June 27th to talk to us about considerations of the disabled community in recreational access in places like Big Basin. So that'll be really good discussion. So thank you, Chris. Thank you to our audience, and we'll see you next month under the Redwoods.